CEO Vivian Sterling refused to pay the final installment owed to Grant Hollis, the single father who had rebuilt her jet from a fire-scorched frame over 6 months. On the eve of handover, she called him a man manufacturing delays to extract money, then ordered Sterling 1 pulled to the runway without his signature. Grant did not argue. He unclipped the maintenance tag from the control panel and walked away. When the engine cycled up, Chief Pilot Nolan Briggs stepped down, found a replaced seal that should not have existed, and said 3 words, "Ground it." Then he asked Vivian, who had altered the records, "If you believe that skill and integrity cannot be stolen, stay with Grant as he unmasks the saboteur who tried to bury both." The hangar at Black Ridge Field had been Grant Hollis's second home for half a year, and on the morning Sterling 1 rolled out into the Carolina sunlight for the first time since the fire, every one of his crew members stopped what they were doing and simply looked. The jet was unrecognizable from the shell that had arrived on a flatbed 18 months earlier. Blackened fuselage, collapsed wiring, a cockpit that had melted in on itself like a spent candle. And what stood before them now was the result of 2,200 hours of precision labor, the kind that left no margin for guessing and no room for shortcuts. Grant had mortgaged Hollis Aero Works to cover material costs after the insurance carrier slow-walked its estimate, and the $650,000 remaining in the final payment was the difference between keeping the shop and watching it fold before the end of the fiscal year. His technicians, Marcus, Diane, and old Pete Rowan, who had been with him since his Air Force days, had not asked about the mortgage, but they knew, because men and women who work closely enough read each other the way pilots read instruments. The project had been declared unrecoverable by 2 larger maintenance firms before Grant accepted it, both citing thermal distortion of the primary frame. But Grant had inspected the load-bearing spars himself and concluded the damage was cosmetic deep enough to look fatal without being structural enough to be so. He rebuilt the cockpit from templates, rewired the main electrical bus from scratch, replaced the pressure sensors and the oxygen delivery system, refitted 40% of the outer skin, and spent the final 6 weeks calibrating the flight management computer until it responded to input the way a well-made instrument should, without hesitation and without ambiguity. On a morning that should have been a celebration, he ran his standard final walkthrough alone, the way he always did, because he had learned long before that pride had a way of making a man overlook the one thing he should have caught first. He found it on the 3rd pass, behind a panel on the starboard side of the avionics bay, a break in the maintenance seal paint that ran across the fasteners in a way that only happened when the cover had been removed and replaced after the seal had dried. Grant set down his flashlight, opened the panel with the same methodical care he applied to everything, and what he found inside was a pitch actuator assembly that he had not installed. Same housing, same connector profile as the certified component he had sourced and logged, but the serial number stamped on the body returned no result in any parts database used by a licensed maintenance shop in the country. He cross-referenced it against the invoice trail, the receiving log, and the torque record his standalone mechanical verification machine had printed 6 days earlier, and the conclusion was inescapable. Someone had removed the genuine actuator after his final inspection and replaced it with a part that had no verifiable origin, no airworthiness certificate, and no material test report. Grant locked the maintenance log, pulled the aircraft's release form from the clipboard near the door, and did not sign it. When Ellis Ward, the procurement director, arrived 20 minutes later and told him the replacement was an equivalent substitute sourced under a parallel procurement channel, Grant asked for the component's certifying authority, its documented test history, and the name of the inspector who had approved its installation, and Ellis produced none of those things. Preston Hawthorne, the chief operating officer, arrived within the hour and told Grant, in the measured tone of a man equally comfortable in boardrooms and on construction sites, that his refusal to release the aircraft constituted a breach of contractual obligation and would be treated accordingly. By the time Vivienne Sterling arrived with 2 board observers and a communications team, the story Preston had given her was already fixed in place. Grant Hollis was a single father with a balloon payment due on a business loan, and he had manufactured a technical objection to lever an additional payment from a company under pressure. Vivienne had not come to negotiate. She had come to take possession of her aircraft, and she said so in front of everyone present, clearly and without softening. Grant told her she could take the aircraft. What she could not take was his signature, because a maintenance release signed by a licensed inspector carried legal weight that a check could not override and a deadline could not rewrite. The exchange lasted 4 minutes and ended when Vivienne declared the contract void under the breach clause, turned away, and left Grant standing beside a jet that was finished in every way except the one way that mattered to the people who would be inside it at altitude. He removed the maintenance tag from the instrument panel. The laminated card that carried his name, his certification number, and the date of the last authorized inspection, folded it twice, and put it in his chest pocket. As he crossed the tarmac toward the Hollis Aero Works van, he passed a junior employee from Ellis Ward's department crouched near the maintenance bay door, pressing a photocopied signature block against the cover page of the aircraft log with hands that were not quite steady, and Grant stopped, looked at the man long enough for both of them to understand what had been seen, and then walked on without a word, because some things do not require words to be clearly understood. Sterling 1 was on the runway before noon, towed by a ground crew working at the pace of people who have been told that time is money, and money is presently running short. Preston had arranged for an internal compliance officer, a junior examiner named Craig Steffens who had been with the company for 11 months, to sign a temporary operational clearance, citing an emergency provision that allowed an alternate authorized signatory when the primary inspector was listed as unavailable. Nolan Briggs arrived at the aircraft as he always did before any flight. Without ceremony and without witnesses, he had not brought himself. He came alone, with his reading glasses and the logbook he had maintained on the aircraft since before the fire, and he began at the front of the document and worked systematically back. The signature block on the current maintenance release carried Grant Hollis's name typed in the standard form font, but the handwriting underneath was off by the precise margin of a man who has copied another man's signature without having studied it enough to match the pen pressure and the exit stroke. Grant wrote his capital G with a full closed loop that turned upward, and the G in the log turned downward, a small thing that no one would notice unless they had reason to look. The timestamp on the release put the signature at 6:47 in the morning, at which point Nolan had personally watched Grant loading his toolbox into his truck and driving away from the field, which was the posture of a man who was finished with a job and had no intention of returning. The tamper seal across the avionics bay, a strip of engineer's tape with the Hollis Aero Works batch number printed at intervals, had been cut and replaced with a strip from a different batch, a color match close enough to pass a glance inspection but not close enough to pass Nolan Briggs, who had been reading aircraft for 22 years and had learned that the details that were almost right were always the ones worth stopping for. He climbed out of the cockpit, walked to the operations desk, and called Grant directly. Grant confirmed he had not signed the release, had not authorized the component substitution, and had not granted clearance for flight operations under any provision. Nolan returned to the aircraft, shut down the auxiliary power unit, and when the operations manager came across the tarmac to ask what the delay was, Nolan said the 2 words that needed saying, "Ground it," and walked toward the tower to file the formal notification with the regulatory authority. The two co-pilots assigned to the afternoon demonstration sent their own written refusal to the flight department within the hour, declining to operate the aircraft without a valid maintenance release from the inspector of record. Vivian watched from the terminal as Nolan spoke to Dana Keene, the aviation safety inspector who arrived in a plain sedan within 40 minutes, faster than anyone expected, which suggested she had never fully accepted that the hangar fire 6 months earlier had been as accidental as the official summary concluded. Preston was at Vivian's side, explaining that Nolan was acting on personal loyalty rather than professional obligation, that this was a dispute over payment dressed in the language of safety, and that every hour of delay against the $5.5 billion Orion acquisition carried a calculable cost. Dana impounded the logbook and the component and placed a formal hold on the airframe, and by the following morning, the story had reached the business press in the shape Preston had designed. A technician with financial difficulties using a safety hold to force payment from a corporation under time pressure, and two companies that had used Hollis Aero Works for routine inspections called to suspend their agreements pending clarification. Dana's preliminary review of the digital maintenance log confirmed what Grant had suspected in the worst way. Someone had accessed the system using Grant's own credentials at 2:13 in the morning, 3 days before the scheduled handover, and had entered a notation approving the component substitution as a compliant equivalent under a technical standard that did not apply to the actuator in question. The camera footage from the hangar that night showed a figure in a Hollis Aero Works jacket moving through the aircraft bay, with the face consistently angled away from the ceiling-mounted unit, as if the camera angle had been studied and accounted for in advance, and the figure wore safety boots with a side panel reinforcement pattern that Grant recognized from the procurement department's standard issue workwear specification, a detail too small to be conclusive on its own, but precise enough to be a thread that deserved following. The case against Grant was clean in the way fabricated cases always are, too clean, with every piece in the correct position and no ragged edges where actual events leave their marks. Preston briefed the board that morning, presenting the digital access log, the camera footage, and the substitute component as a coherent narrative. Grant had swapped a certified part for a cheaper uncertified one, kept the cost difference, and then staged a refusal to sign in order to reframe his substitution as a discovered safety hazard and leverage an additional payment. Vivian's attorneys were already drafting a fraud claim when Mara Winslow, the company's chief legal counsel, arrived from a flight back from New York and asked to see the original camera footage before anyone filed anything, a request so routine that no one objected. What Mara found was that the footage had been exported in a compressed format that did not match the camera system's native output. Someone had rendered it down from a higher resolution original, and the compression had introduced a 4-frame discontinuity. At the moment the figure in the Hollis jacket entered the cockpit, the kind of artifact that compression produces when two source clips are joined at a cut point rather than recorded continuously. She placed a legal hold on every piece of electronic evidence before anyone could delete additional files, and she told Vivian that what they had was not an open and shut fraud case, but a situation that needed to be fully understood before it was litigated in any direction. Grant had gone back to the shop that evening, not because he expected to find something useful, but because working with his hands was the way he organized his thinking when his mind was running faster than his conclusions could form. The shop's internal diagnostic terminal had been accessed remotely at 4:41 in the morning, 2 days before the handover, and 14 project files had been overwritten with edited versions that altered the component specifications. But the torque verification machine, a standalone mechanical unit that printed paper records independent of the shop's digital network, had produced a log on the same day. Grant installed the genuine actuator, showing the correct component seated at the manufacturer's specified torque, with a batch identifier that matched the certified part he had ordered. The machine did not communicate with any network. It printed, and the paper sat in the output tray until someone collected it, and no one had collected it because no one had anticipated it would become the most important document in the building. That single paper record placed the certified actuator inside the aircraft 6 days before the handover, which meant that whatever was in the avionics bay when Grant opened the panel on the morning of the inspection had been put there deliberately after he was finished, not before and not by him. Brooke called that evening and asked Grant directly whether he was considering signing a provisional release in exchange for the payment and a settlement clause. He told her no, because a signature on a maintenance release was the one thing in his professional life that could not be taken back or renegotiated after the fact. Brooke said she knew that, and that her mother had always said the name Hollis on the hangar door was supposed to mean something a person could trust without checking. And then she told him to eat something, because she knew he had not. Nolan arrived an hour later carrying photocopied flight logs from the months before the fire, set the folder on the work table, and pointed to an entry dated 8 days before the hangar burned. Sterling One's flight data system had logged an anomalous signal from the pitch control actuator during a routine approach, flagged by the onboard monitoring system and then cleared the following morning by Ellis Ward, not by any certificated inspector, and not with a corrective action attached. Nolan said he had been thinking about that log entry for 6 months, and that he was done thinking about it quietly. The official investigation into the hangar fire had concluded that the ignition source was a failed auxiliary battery pack in the storage area adjacent to the aircraft bay, a finding that fit the physical evidence well enough that no one had pressed harder, partly because the fire had consumed most of the potential contrary evidence, and partly because Preston Hawthorne had placed 3 separate calls to the Regional Oversight Office in the 48 hours following the incident, calls that were logged without record of their content. Nolan's flight log entry changed the sequence. The pitch actuator anomaly had appeared before the fire, which meant that the component showing degraded performance was already in the aircraft when the hangar burned. And if the fire had been set specifically to eliminate that history, then someone had planned it with a clear and narrow purpose. Grant drove to the storage facility where he had moved salvageable components after the initial damage assessment, before the insurance adjuster completed his report, and he found among the preserved debris a section of wiring harness from the aft electrical bay with a cut end that was too clean for heat damage. The alloy had been sliced with a blade rather than melted or brittle, fractured the way material behaves when a fire reaches it at temperature. He photographed it, bagged it, and called Dana Keene before 7 in the morning without apology for the hour, because the hour had stopped mattering sometime the previous evening. Dana reopened the fire investigation within the day, and what her team recovered from the original scene photographs taken by a contracted firm and filed without extensive analysis, was a sequence of details that had been present all along and simply never read in combination. The hangar's overhead suppression system had been placed in maintenance bypass mode 46 minutes before the fire alarm triggered, a status change logged automatically by the building management system and attributed to a routine test cycle that no scheduled maintenance record supported. A vehicle registered to the Sterling Crown Procurement Department had been captured on the access road camera at 11:17 that night, moving toward the hangar rather than away from it. The camera covering the primary bay door had experienced a 7-minute recording gap beginning at 11:49. Not a power failure, which would have produced a system restart log, but a clean gap, the kind produced by a direct buffer command from someone with access to the recording system's administrative controls. Grant found the final piece not through electronics, but through the work of someone who had not anticipated that a rebuilder would go back to the original structure after everything useful had ostensibly been consumed. Pressed into a fold of the frame rail, protected by a section of titanium heat shield that had deflected the worst of the thermal loading, was a shipping label fragment bearing the partial name of a supplier, Altair Precision Components, a name that appeared nowhere in the Sterling Crown approved vendor registry Grant had been given at the project's start. Mara ran the name through corporate database services her firm maintained and found Altair Precision Components registered in Delaware, modestly capitalized, with no visible operations and a single listed officer who turned out to be a paralegal at a trust management firm in Wilmington. The kind of structure built to hold assets at a comfortable distance from their actual owner. The beneficial ownership chain ran through two intermediate entities before connecting to a private equity vehicle, whose quarterly returns included a line of income attributed to aerospace component distribution, and one entity in that chain listed a silent partner by initials only, initials that matched a name Vivian recognized without being told the full name. She did not say Preston's name aloud in that meeting, and Mara did not press her to, because Mara had spent enough time in corporate litigation to know that the moment a chief executive names a suspect, every subsequent action is complicated by the accusation. Preston arrived at Vivian's office that afternoon with a prepared summary suggesting Ellis Ward had been running the Altair relationship independently, routing purchases through his procurement authority without upward direction, a story that was structurally possible, factually hollow, and constructed by someone who understood exactly which gaps in the paper trail his explanation would need to span. Vivian called Grant to her office at 7 in the morning, before the communications staff arrived, and before the board's formal day began, in the window when a building full of powerful people briefly becomes a place where honest conversation is possible. She offered him the $650,000 against a provisional release. Not a full certification, she was careful to specify, but a documented acknowledgement that the work he had performed met the agreed specifications except for the disputed component, and Grant listened to the entire offer without interrupting, which was not what Vivian had expected from a man whose shop was hemorrhaging contracts and whose loan officer was leaving messages with the urgency of a man approaching the end of his professional patience. He declined, clearly and without heat, and explained that the payment amount and the technical status of the aircraft were two separate questions that could not be compressed into a single document, because signing anything that implied the aircraft was provisionally airworthy while an uncertified component remained in the avionics bay would transfer legal responsibility from the person who had installed the false part to the person who acknowledged the aircraft's condition, which was him, and which was precisely what someone in this situation would want to engineer. What he would accept was straightforward: full payment for completed work, reimbursement for the diagnostic time and component removal that the substitution had made necessary, and an independent technical review conducted by an inspector with no prior relationship to Sterling Crown Aviation. Vivian authorized the transfer of the undisputed portion of the payment before she left the building that morning, and found by noon that the transfer had been placed in a hold queue by the Treasury function pending board authorization, a requirement that had never been applied to operational payments at this level in the company's history, and that could only have been imposed by someone with sufficient access to the Treasury system's approval hierarchy to insert a new constraint while no one was watching. The board notification arrived that same afternoon. Sterling, 1, was required to be operational within 48 hours, or the scheduled aircraft system demonstration would be canceled. The Orion acquisition would enter indefinite suspension, and the board would convene to consider whether Vivienne's management of the company's technical operations had become a liability to the transaction's completion. Grant had come to understand the aircraft's role in the acquisition clearly enough to know that the demonstration was not incidental. The entire argument for the acquisition price rested on Sterling Crown's proprietary flight management technology, and the demonstration was where that technology was to be shown, operating under real conditions in a purpose-rebuilt aircraft that had been structurally and electronically rehabilitated to serve as the test platform. Without a legitimate release from a licensed inspector, the demonstration could not legally proceed. With a forged release, it would proceed under conditions that any competent attorney could use to void the demonstration's evidentiary value after the fact. Grant explained to Vivienne, in terms she followed without needing them simplified, that the uncertified actuator would pass every standard ground-level functional test because its failure mode was pressure and temperature dependent. The part behaved correctly at ambient conditions and only became a danger at altitude, in cold air, under sustained load, where the alloy's thermal properties diverged from the certified component's specification in ways that would register as a transient control lag rather than a catastrophic failure. But a control lag in the pitch axis during a demonstration maneuver was not a small event. The only facility equipped to replicate high-altitude thermal and pressure conditions on a static component bench was the environmental test lab that the engineering department maintained, a lab that reported directly to Preston Hawthorne, and Vivienne used an executive override to open the lab and directed the building systems team to restore its access credentials to her administrative account without routing the change through the COO's office. Grant said he would be there the following morning, and that he was not doing it to help the acquisition succeed. He was doing it because Nolan Briggs and 2 other pilots had staked their professional standing on the aircraft being grounded, and he was not willing to leave people who had stood for the right thing exposed to the consequences of having done so. Before he left the building, Vivienne gathered the Hollis Aero Works crew who had worked on the rebuild and apologized to them directly in the corridor outside the operations suite for the language she had used in her statement to the board, language that had called their work a deliberate delay and their professionalism a financial strategy. Grant waited until she had finished, and then said that an apology was the correct starting place, and that trust was rebuilt the same way an aircraft was, not by declaring it fixed, but by going through every system one by one until you could account for each of them fully. Vivienne nodded and did not argue. The actuator disappeared from the secure storage area sometime between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, during the window when the facility's overnight custodian took his meal break and the secondary access log ran on a 15-minute polling cycle rather than continuous recording. The camera outside the storage room showed Dana Keene's credential used to open the door at 12:43, and the image showed a figure in a dark jacket moving inside for 9 minutes before leaving. But Dana had been on the other side of the state at a professional conference at that hour, with a time-stamped hotel keycard and a dinner receipt to confirm it, and the footage had been constructed from a recording of a real inspection visit Dana had made to the same room 6 weeks earlier. A 12-second loop stitched into the overnight recording with precision that required both access to the camera system and prior knowledge of when Dana's legitimate visit had taken place. The actual entry had been made using a badge registered to Ellis Ward, whose access privileges had not been revoked despite the ongoing investigation, an oversight Mara had flagged the previous day that the security manager had not yet processed. By morning, Ellis Ward was not at his desk and not responding to his phone, and Preston issued a statement to the board, noting that Ward's disappearance was consistent with the behavior of a person who had exceeded his authority in the procurement function and was now unwilling to face the consequences of acting without direction from above. Grant did not believe Ellis Ward had acted alone, and he said so to Nolan and Mara in the engineering conference room, clearly enough that there was no ambiguity about what he meant or who he meant it about. A man running an operation of this complexity, counterfeit component sourcing, camera manipulation, credential theft, digital record alteration, arson timed to destroy specific evidence, was not a procurement director operating on personal initiative. He was an executor, and executors of this precision do not disappear when a piece of evidence goes missing unless someone with authority has told them where to go. One of the storage facility's ground crew, a woman named Patrice, who had worked the overnight shift for 6 years and noticed considerably more than people assumed she did, told Grant that Ellis had stopped in the parking lot the previous evening and said something she had not fully understood at the time, that if the aircraft stayed on the ground, everyone was going to lose more than money. Spoken in the voice of a man who was afraid of a specific person rather than a general outcome. Grant proposed using the sabotage scheme against itself. They would place a replica actuator, a genuine certified component modified to look visually identical to the counterfeit unit, inside the aircraft, while the real evidence component, which Dana had fully photographed and cataloged before the theft, was secured in a location only Dana and Mara knew. The announcement that the aircraft was proceeding to a ground run demonstration would be made in a way that reached everyone in the building, including Preston, who would have no cause to believe his component had been removed from the evidentiary chain. Vivian made the announcement with the tone of a person who has recovered her footing, and Preston's response: a measured expression of satisfaction and a request that the demonstration include a high-power engine run to validate the flight management system's throttle integration at realistic power levels, was the response of a man who believed Sterling One's control system was still compromised and was positioning himself for what came next. When 2 board members pushed back on Nolan's insistence on an unmanned ground run and suggested a pilot-operated low-altitude circuit would be more persuasive to the Orion acquisition team, every certificated pilot employed by Sterling Crown filed a written declaration within 2 hours stating they would not operate the aircraft without a maintenance release signed by the inspector of record. And Preston recognized, visibly, that he could not legally compel any certificated aviator to fly an aircraft they had declared unsafe, because that was one of the few protections in aviation law that no level of corporate authority could override. Sterling One sat on the secondary test runway at Black Ridge Field in the early morning light, attended by a ground crew of 4 and monitored from the tower by Nolan Briggs, with the board, the acquisition team representatives, and a small group of press observers positioned behind the safety barrier near the operations building. There was no one inside the aircraft. Grant had worked through most of the previous night installing the sensor package himself. 3 independent data recorders networked to each other but completely isolated from the aircraft's own avionics. A mechanical fuel cutoff tethered to a hardened radio receiver on a separate frequency from anything the aircraft's systems used, and a set of strain gauges on the actuator housing that would capture any change in load profile from the first second of engine power. Nolan had the fuel cutoff transmitter in his hand from the moment the engines were started, and he had told Grant before they parted the previous evening that he would use it without hesitation and without waiting for instruction from anyone whose name appeared on an organizational chart. The ground run began at 8:14, the engine cycling through their startup sequence with the precise, unhurried sound of a well-maintained turbofan that knows its job. And then, at 8:16 and 43 seconds, the Apex Flight Management System logged an inbound command packet from an external source on a maintenance access frequency that should not have been active during an operational test, and the packet contained 3 sequential instructions. Advance throttle to 92%, disengage ground brakes, and engage the autonomous takeoff protocol that had been embedded in the software as an engineering test function and never formally disabled. The aircraft began to move. The throttle response was immediate. The brake release followed within 1 second, and Stirling 1 accelerated down the test runway with the particular purposeful momentum of a machine that has been told clearly and unambiguously what to do. Grant keyed the cutoff transmitter. The fuel shutoff valves closed. The engines spooled from operating power down to 0 over 11 seconds, and the aircraft rolled out of its acceleration and came to rest on the grass overrun at the far end of the pavement, intact, unoccupied, with every data recorder still running and every sensor intact, and with no one hurt. The independent recorders had captured the command packet's source address, a transmitter unit registered to the operations network of the Chief Operating Officer's suite, accessed through a portable device that could be operated from any point within the field's perimeter. Preston was not in his office when the transmission was sent. He was at the safety barrier with the board members, watching, and by the time Dana's team traced the signal, Preston was already composing a statement in which Ellis Ward, acting from an unknown location in a final act of desperation, had sent the command in an attempt to destroy the evidence of his own culpability. Ellis Ward reappeared at the field's main gate at noon, not running, not hiding, but walking, with an attorney at his side, and he stood in front of Dana's investigative team and stated that he had sent the command, that he accepted responsibility, and that he was prepared to make a full statement. Grant listened from across the room and watched Ellis's face, and what he saw was not the expression of a man confessing to something he had done independently. It was the expression of a man reading from a document that someone else had written and handed to him that morning, with specific instructions about what would happen to his family if he deviated from the prepared text by more than a sentence. Ellis waited until the formal statement was recorded and the legal caution had been read, and then in the parking lot outside, with the attorney momentarily out of earshot, he pressed a small key into Grant's palm and said, without looking directly at him, that the evidence Preston needed erased was still inside the aircraft, that the fire had not reached everything it was supposed to reach, and that Grant would know where to look. The key was machined for a panel flush lock mounted below the cockpit floor, the kind of installation that does not appear on a standard maintenance drawing because it was added outside the normal engineering change process. A personal modification by someone who wanted to store something in the aircraft that was not documented in the aircraft's official records. Grant had rebuilt the floor section around that lock housing during the reconstruction, leaving it in place because it was integrated into the structural panel and because he had assumed it was a legacy mount for portable ground support equipment. He had not known what the lock opened until the key was in his hand and he was crouched on the cockpit floor at 10 in the evening, with Dana Keene and Mara Winslow watching from the doorway, and the flashlight beam settled on a bespoke data recorder whose thermal protection rating significantly exceeded what the fire had produced. Installed on the order of Vivienne's father when he ran the company, maintained without documentation in the years since his death, and believed by Preston to have been destroyed in a fire he had designed to be thorough enough to destroy it. Preston had known the recorder existed. He had been with the company long enough to know everything that mattered, and the single error in his calculation was that he had not been the one to specify its protection rating, and the man who had specified it had been a man who trusted nothing to chance. The data inside covered 14 months. Grant and Dana worked through the night with a forensic data specialist the regulatory authority had on call, pulling records in chronological order and assembling a sequence that, once complete, was not ambiguous in any of its significant details. There were command logs showing the hangar suppression system placed in bypass mode using a credential linked to the COO's office 38 minutes before the fire's ignition point. There were procurement system entries ordering components from Altair Precision Components on 17 separate occasions across 11 months, routed through Ellis Ward's account but approved at the COO authorization level, required for orders exceeding a certain financial threshold. There were financial records showing transfer confirmations between Altair's parent vehicle and a discretionary account Preston Hawthorne controlled personally, totaling $193 million across the covered period, paid by Sterling Crown as the price of certified components, received in the form of uncertified substitutes, with the difference converted to personal gain. And there was an audio file, recorded by the aircraft's own cabin microphone during a meeting held inside Sterling, 3 months before the fire, in which Preston's voice said plainly that the aircraft did not need to go down. It only needed to be the reason the board lost its confidence in the woman flying it. Vivienne stood in the forensic room and listened to her father's recorder give back the voice of the man she had trusted longest. And she was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, it was to tell Mara to schedule the board for first thing the following morning. Preston, who had filed his own emergency board session the previous evening, under the provision allowing senior officers to convene a meeting when the company faced imminent material risk, had set the agenda as a motion to temporarily suspend Vivienne's operational authority, pending an investigation into her management of the Sterling One situation. And when Grant arrived at the building the next morning, Preston met him in the hallway outside the boardroom and offered him, in a sealed envelope, twice the contract amount as a direct personal payment in exchange for testifying that all technical failures traced exclusively to Ellis Ward, acting alone and without instruction. Grant looked at the envelope, held it long enough that Preston read the pause as consideration, and then asked the building facilities manager, very quietly, to confirm that the boardroom's audio system was recording. Grant placed the envelope on the conference table without opening it, took a seat on the side of the table that no one had assigned him, and began speaking in the measured voice of a man who has organized his materials with care and is in no hurry. He laid out the torque verification printout first, the paper record, independent of every network in the building, showing the certified actuator installed and seated 6 days before the handover, in Grant's hand, under his certification number. He placed beside it the maintenance seal photographs showing the tamper pattern on the avionics bay panel, the forensic comparison of the logbook signature, the digital access timestamp from 2:13 in the morning against the field security record showing Grant had badged out at 9:40 the previous evening. He presented the Altair label fragment recovered from the aircraft frame, the corporate ownership chain linking Altair to Preston's discretionary account, the suppression bypass command log, the procurement authorization records, and the audio from the recorder in the floor of Sterling One. And he played the audio through the boardroom's own system, the one that was recording, so that Preston's voice filled the room at a volume that left no interpretive uncertainty about its meaning. Ellis Ward, brought into the room as a witness at Grant's request, confirmed under direct questioning that he had purchased components from Altair on Preston's direction, that he had physically replaced the certified actuator using access tools arranged by Preston's office. that he had altered the digital maintenance records using remote access credentials Preston had provided, and that every step of the operation had been given to him as a verbal instruction, never written, never signed, always framed as a suggestion from a person whose suggestions carried the weight of commands. Mara presented the financial records to the board, annotating each transfer with the corresponding procurement date and the resulting inventory discrepancy, a cross-reference that established, with accounting precision, that $193 million in company funds had been paid for certified components and that uncertified substitutes had been received in their place, with the difference routed through Altair to Preston's personal account. Dana confirmed to the board that the physical and digital evidence was sufficient to support federal referral, and that she had made that referral effective at 6 that morning. Preston's attorney stated that his client had no further statement at this time, and the board voted within the next 90 seconds to suspend Preston pending investigation and table the motion against Vivienne's authority indefinitely. Grant removed from his jacket the original invoice for the Sterling One rebuild, the same document that had been in dispute since the morning he refused to sign, and placed it on the table. The number on it was the number it had always carried, $650,000 for completed work, net of prior installments, with a supplemental line of $62,000 in diagnostic and remediation costs incurred as a direct result of the actuator substitution. He asked that payment be made to the full crew of Hollis Aero Works, not to him individually, because the work had been theirs equally, and the hardship of the past several days had been theirs equally as well. Vivienne signed the payment authorization in front of the board without discussion and pushed it to the company treasurer. Preston, as he was escorted from the room by 2 members of Dana's team, looked at Grant and said he had nearly destroyed a perfectly good business over a component the size of a thermos. Grant said that a component the size of a thermos, installed in the wrong position, could put 2 pilots and 6 passengers into the ground without warning, and that the aircraft did not know or care how small the failure was, only whether it had been properly addressed before the wheels left the pavement. The federal investigation that followed took 11 months and produced charges against Preston Hawthorne covering procurement fraud, embezzlement, falsification of aviation maintenance records, destruction of safety-critical evidence, interference with a regulatory investigation, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, a list that grew as investigators worked backward through the Altair relationship and found the component substitution scheme at Sterling Crown was not the first of its kind, only the most recent. Ellis Ward entered into a cooperation agreement with the prosecution from the first formal interview, and the terms he received reflected the law's distinction between a man who executed instructions under sustained pressure and a man who issued those instructions for personal enrichment. Ellis faced civil liability and professional disqualification. Preston faced a criminal trial before a jury. Sterling Crown terminated every supply relationship connected to the Altair network within 30 days, commissioned an independent audit of every component in its fleet over the preceding 3 years, and replaced its internal procurement oversight with a structure in which component sourcing verification reported directly to the full board, bypassing the operational management chain entirely. Vivienne issued a formal policy statement she drafted herself, without input from the legal department. No member of executive management was permitted to pressure a certificated maintenance inspector to modify or accelerate a safety determination. All components above a defined value threshold required independent verification before installation, and any person holding safety of flight responsibility had unconditional authority to ground an aircraft without management approval. The policy was posted at the entrance of every Sterling Crown facility. Only the words, in plain type, in a location where no one entering could miss them. The work of restoring Sterling 1 to proper condition was straightforward in the way that work is always straightforward when there is no pressure attached to the outcome and no deadline imposed by someone whose interest in the result is financial rather than technical. Grant removed the substitute actuator, sourced the genuine certified replacement from the original manufacturer with complete documentation and a full material test report, and then conducted a comprehensive re-inspection of every system he had rebuilt, not because the investigation required it, but because the principle required it, which was that when a machine has been compromised in one place, you do not assume all other places are intact. Nolan Briggs reviewed the completed logbook 3 days after the regulatory hold on the aircraft was formally lifted, verified every entry from the first page to last, and handed the book back to Grant without words, in the way that experienced people confirm completed work, not with praise, which would be insufficient, but with the act of returning authority to the person who holds it. Grant signed the maintenance release in the early morning, before anyone else arrived at the field, using the pen his wife had given him when he opened the shop. A plain steel pen engraved with a single word on the barrel, "Right." He added the date, the certification number, and the aircraft identifier, and placed the carbon copy in the logbook, and he did not feel the need to show it to anyone before putting the book back in its place. The first flight of Sterling 1 under the restored release was not a demonstration and was not a press event. It was a functional check flight, conducted as functional checks are conducted, with minimum crew and undivided attention. Nolan at the controls, the first officer in the right seat, and Grant at the systems monitoring station in the cabin, watching the flight management data the way he had watched it in simulations for 6 months of rebuild. Vivienne was the only passenger, seated across from Grant, and she did not speak for the first 40 minutes of the flight, which Grant took as evidence that she understood the occasion well enough to treat it with the respect it deserved. When she finally spoke, she asked him whether he believed the aircraft was safe. Not whether the paperwork was in order, not whether the legal exposure had been resolved, but whether he believed it. He said that every question had been answered, every system had been verified, and every record was accurate and complete, and that in his professional judgment, the aircraft was airworthy, and that this was the first time since the project began that he had been able to say that with certainty, without a reservation he was keeping to himself. They landed at Blackridge Field 2 hours after departure, and the aircraft touched down cleanly, the way a well-made thing moves when all of its parts are in their proper place and functioning as designed. Brooke was standing outside the operations building when Grant came down the air stairs, and she did not say anything because she did not need to. She had her father's face, and she had grown up reading it the way pilots read instruments. Vivienne handed Grant a small metal placard milled from the same aluminum alloy used in the aircraft structural panels, engraved with the phrase, "No payment is worth a life." Grant held it and said, without unkindness, that he would prefer a version that said something about deadlines and safety, rather than money and safety, because the lesson he had taken from the past several days was not really about money. It was about the specific kind of pressure that made people want to move faster than the work allowed. Vivienne said she understood. The revised placard arrived within the week, reading "No deadline outranks safety," and 2 copies were made. One was mounted beside the diagnostic bench at Hollis Aero Works, where Grant did his most careful work, and one was placed at the entrance corridor of Sterling Crown's headquarters in Charleston, where it remained after everything else from that period had been changed or removed or quietly filed away. Some weeks later, Vivienne called Grant and asked whether he would meet her for dinner to discuss the structure of a formal independent inspection agreement that would preserve Hollis Aeroworks' autonomy while formalizing the access and authority that the crisis had demonstrated to be necessary. Grant said yes on 2 conditions. The meeting would take place somewhere without a conference table, and there would be nothing resembling a check placed between them at any point during the evening. Vivienne said she knew exactly the right place. Grant said he trusted that she did, and that he had learned, in the course of the past several days, that her word was worth considerably more than he had given it credit for. At the moment she unclipped the maintenance tag from the control panel and handed it back to him without being asked.
OG Ninja Gaiden. Damn. Goku from Dragon Ball is inspired by this guy. For real. No, he really was. Swear.
And so ends the last tale of Sun Wukong.
Good luck, you'll need it. Oh,
A
yeah.
hero who treasured his freedom above all else. Buddhahood he attained, yes, but
Tuesday Heist
cumbersome
on GTA
he
for this
found
fuck
the
with
celestial
randoms?
rules,
Is it?
For he yearned to come back and to revel in the simple joys with
What's
us.
up? First playthrough? Oh, wait, how's your day going? Faded A's, how you
Little
doing?
did he know
Thank
his
you.
choice to
Cause you to
forgo the
rage? Oh, I'm
life
definitely gonna
above
rage.
only fueled
Tuesday
their
Heist hard. Yeah, yeah. Oh, it is
mistrust.
hard, bro. How you doing, Malung? How's your day going? What's up, Placid? This will be like maybe my 3rd playthrough, but I still haven't beat the game. I made it up until the last boss the last time.